In 2018, a team of archaeologists excavating a burial site in the Andes Mountains of Peru uncovered something that made them stop completely. The grave contained the skeleton of a young woman, approximately 19 years old, buried approximately 9,000 years ago. Around her body were laid 18 hunting tools, stone projectile points, scrapers, and blades used specifically for large game hunting. She was not buried beside these tools, she was buried as their owner. That finding did not fit the model. For over a century, the assumption had been almost universal. Prehistoric men hunted, prehistoric women gathered. The image was so embedded that it had become invisible, treated not as a hypothesis, but as a baseline fact. The textbooks said it, the museum dioramas showed it, the documentaries narrated it, and almost no one had gone back to check whether the bones actually agreed. So when Randall Haas of the University of California, Davis published his analysis of this burial in the journal Science Advances in 2020, the question it raised was not a small one. How many other assumptions about prehistoric life had been built on a foundation that was never actually tested? Haas and his team did not stop at the single burial. They examined 429 individuals from burial sites across North and South America, dating from 8,000 to 14,000 years ago. Of those, 27 were buried with big game hunting tools. 11 of those 27 were women. That is approximately 40%. In a sample this size, from this time period across 2 continents, the number was too consistent to be coincidental. Haas concluded that big game hunting among early hunter-gatherers was not a male-exclusive activity. It may never have been. The woman in Peru was not an anomaly waiting to be explained away. She was the beginning of a pattern that had been sitting in the ground for thousands of years, unasked about. But knowing that women hunted is only half the question. The deeper question is why this was so systematically erased, not just from written history, which did not yet exist, but from the scientific models built to explain prehistory itself. And beneath that question is an even stranger one. If women were hunting large game at these rates, were they simply participating in something men had built? Or were they doing something that required an entirely different set of skills? Skills that in some conditions made them not just capable hunters, but more effective ones. The simpler explanation is availability. In small prehistoric bands of perhaps 20 to 30 individuals, survival depended on everyone contributing at maximum capacity. There was no surplus of labor. No one could afford to sit out. When a hunt was organized, excluding half the group's able-bodied adults would have been a catastrophic inefficiency that smaller bands simply could not survive. On this reading, prehistoric gender roles were more fluid because they had to be. The rigid division that came later was not an ancient inheritance. It was a product of settled agriculture, surplus food, and the social structures that followed. The division came with the farm, not with the spear. The more complex explanation involves something physiological and strategic that goes beyond availability. Kara Walscheffler, a biological anthropologist at Seattle Pacific University, has spent years analyzing the biomechanics of early human movement. Her research, published in PLOS One in 2023, examined the energetic cost of walking and running in adult males and females carrying loads across varied terrain. The findings were precise. Women, on average, carry weight more efficiently over long distances due to differences in hip structure and stride mechanics. The pelvis angle, the length of the femur relative to total leg length, the distribution of mass. These differences combine to produce a lower energetic cost per kilometer traveled when carrying a load. In a context where a hunt could span 20 to 30 miles of difficult terrain over an entire day, that efficiency gap was not trivial. It was a structural advantage that no one had thought to measure until recently. Walscheffler's work did not claim that women were universally better hunters. It claimed something more precise, that in long-distance persistence hunting, where the strategy is to track an animal across hours or days until it collapses from exhaustion, the physical cost structure favored female hunters in ways the field had never quantified. That is a meaningful distinction. It is not a reversal of the old story. It is the introduction of a variable the old story never bothered to include. Think about what persistence hunting actually demands. It is not about strength. It is not about speed. It requires reading animal tracks across changing terrain, predicting the movement of prey over many hours, adjusting to wind direction and temperature, maintaining a sustainable pace without overheating, and making decisions at a distance from the group that cannot be communicated back to anyone. The hunter is alone with the landscape and a chain of quiet deductions. It is closer to solving a moving problem than it is to a physical contest. In the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer groups studied in depth by researchers, the pattern is documented and observable. Frank Marlowe of Cambridge University conducted extensive fieldwork with the Hadza across the 1990s and 2000s, recording the range of tasks performed by men and women across different seasons, different resource conditions, and different group compositions. What he found was that the division of labor was real but permeable. When conditions shifted, when a particular food source became scarce, when a group size dropped, when a hunt required a different strategy, the boundaries moved. Women hunted prey, men gathered plant foods. The roles were not fixed, they were responsive. Among the Agta people of the Philippines, the evidence goes further. The Agta are a hunter-gatherer group in which women hunt regularly, sometimes with dogs, sometimes alongside men, and sometimes entirely alone. Anthropologist Agnes Estioko Griffin documented Agta women hunting wild pigs and deer during fieldwork in the 1980s, providing some of the first systematic recorded evidence that female hunting in living populations was not a curiosity, but a pattern that persisted across generations under specific ecological conditions. The Agta women who hunted were not younger or without children. Several were mothers. The behavior did not disappear under the weight of other responsibilities. It coexisted with them. Further north, archaeological sites in Siberia from the Upper Paleolithic period, roughly 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, have produced burials where women were interred with the ornaments associated in other sites with high-status hunters: perforated animal teeth, carved ivory beads, specific arrangements of stone tools. The evidence is not uniform across every site, and researchers continue to debate its interpretation, but the pattern keeps appearing in locations that are geographically disconnected and culturally distinct, which makes a single local explanation increasingly difficult to sustain. One of the most striking pieces of evidence came not from a burial at all, but from a footprint. In 2020, researchers analyzing ancient tracks preserved in the dried mud of White Sands Park in New Mexico identified a set of prints from approximately 10,000 years ago. The tracks belonged to a single individual, identified by foot dimensions and pressure distribution as likely female and adolescent, who was carrying a small child on one hip while moving at speed across open, exposed ground. Circling the outward path were the prints of a giant ground sloth, an animal that could reach 3 meters tall and weighed close to a metric ton. On the return journey, the human tracks showed a faster pace. The child was still being carried. What the footprints cannot say is whether the encounter was a hunt or an evasion, but the physical record of a young woman carrying a child, moving fast across open ground past a megafauna predator, does not suggest someone who was waiting at camp. What the science cannot yet fully resolve is the question of intention and frequency. Identifying a woman buried with hunting tools tells you she hunted. It does not tell you how often she hunted, whether she specialized in prey that differed from the men in her group, or whether her role shifted across the seasons of her life. Researchers are still actively debating how to separate biological tendency from culturally assigned role in populations that left no language behind. We cannot ask the woman in the Andean grave what she considered her identity. We can only read what the people who buried her decided to place around her body, and they chose 18 hunting tools. There is also the question of survivorship bias in the archaeological record itself. Organic materials decay. Plant fibers, woven baskets, wooden digging sticks, the tools associated with gathering, disappear from the ground far faster than stone points. The record that survives is weighted towards what stone survives, and stone was used primarily in hunting. Any reconstruction of prehistoric life built primarily on what stone survives is already working with a tilted sample. The absence of evidence for female gathering in the burial record is not evidence that female gathering did not dominate. It is evidence that wood rots. But what the cumulative evidence does show is this: the clean division between male hunter and female gatherer was not a universal prehistoric truth. It was a projection built by researchers who brought their own cultural assumptions into their interpretations and reinforced by a century of repetition that mistook familiarity for proof. The real picture was messier, more adaptive, and in some terrain and some seasons, more effective precisely because it did not hold the boundaries rigid. The woman buried in the Andes with 18 hunting tools was not an exception they failed to explain away. She was a data point the field had spent a century failing to look for. She had been there for 9,000 years, waiting under the stone. The tools were still sharp.